Hi everyone, it's Laura here, and in today's video I'm going to share with you a card that I created with the Waffle Flower Bear Hugs stamp set and the no-line coloring technique with Illustrator markers. The stamp set that I'm using today is part of the latest release by Waffle Flower, and it's really adorable. A few months ago, they also released another stamp set with critters hugging like this from the same Big Bear and Bird series. I got that and I loved it, so when I saw they were coming out with another stamp set of the same kind, I had to grab it. I shared a little haul in my stories on Instagram, so maybe you want to follow me there too for future hauls, and I will have that in the highlights of my stories if you're curious. Anyway, I stamped my images on some Neenah Solar White cardstock that I had previously die cut with the Fawn large stitched rectangle Stackables dies, and I stamped my images with Inkon3 Fadeout Ink. You can probably not see anything at this point, and that's kind of the point because I wanted to go for some no-line coloring today. The Inkon3 Fadeout Ink is really great for no-line coloring. It works for alcohol-based markers and for water-based markers too, or for any water-based medium. So it's really versatile and it produces really nice effects. For my coloring, as I said, I'll be using my Spectrum Noir Illustrator markers. These are relatively new to me, so I'm still playing around with them and figuring them out, but I have to say that I really love them. They are similar to the Spectrum Noir originals that I have in that they are alcohol-based, so they can be blended with each other, but the ink formulation is new, so they blend even more easily, and they have some brush tips, whereas the Spectrum Noir originals have a bullet tip and a chisel tip. So these ones here have a brush tip and a precision tip. The brush tip is really great, it's springy and it's really precise. It allows you to get very accurate flicks, and because of the flicks it's also easier to blend the markers together. So I am very happy that I got these markers, and I'm definitely going to feature them in future videos too. As for the coloring, I'm not doing anything that is too different from what I do when I do, let's say, traditional coloring, so when I'm not going for a no-line look. In this case, I'm making sure that I have nice and dark shadows so that I have enough contrast between the images in order to actually get that separation between each element in the drawing. So I'm also choosing colors that will contrast nicely with each other to color critters that sit next to each other. For this little piglet over here, I used some skin tones. I started with FS5, FS8 and FS7, and then I decided that I wanted my shadows to be a little bit darker, so I came in with my TN3 marker, which is a warm brown marker, and I deepened the shadows a little bit. As for the shading, I am assuming that the light comes from the center of the image, so what is on the left will have the darker shadows on the left, and what is on the right will have the darkest shadows on the right. This way, the eye of the viewer is drawn towards the center of the image, so towards the center of this sweet hug. Next, I started coloring the fox, and I wasn't sure how dark I wanted to go with my shadows, so I started with my TN5 marker. I'm going for some oranges and warm browns because I wanted to give this reddish appearance to the fox. As you can see here, I laid the shadows on the left side of the image, and then I'm going to start blending them out with my mid-tone marker, which is my BO3 marker. This is a burnt orange, so it's not very saturated, but it's a nice and warm color. And for my highlights, I used the BO1 marker. At this point, I started realizing that I wanted more contrast on the fox, so I deepened the shadows with a TN7 marker and then blended everything out again with my TN5 and then the BO3 and the BO1. I repeated the same steps for the face of the fox, so I'm going to darken my shadows with my TN7 marker, and then I'm going to blend everything out with the rest of the markers in this color combination. And in order to get a nice blend and to intensify the contrast, I tend to go over my areas a couple of times so that I really get that smooth transition with my markers. And this is something that I do regardless of whether I do no-line coloring or I'm coloring an image that I stamped with black ink. For the tail, I wasn't exactly sure how to position the shadows yet and how dark I wanted to go. One issue is that the tail touches the face, or rather is overlapped with the face of the fox, so I needed to bring in a darker marker than the one I had on the face of the fox to really outline the contrast between those two areas and not have them sort of merge into each other. So I used a TN8 marker, which is an additional marker to the ones that I used so far on the fox, to add the shadows to the tail right behind the fox's body and its face. And then I started blending everything out with the rest of the markers in this color combination. So with my TN7, TN5, BO3 and BO1. At this point, I also realized that the shading on the tip of the tail was looking a little bit odd, so the tail didn't look really rounded. So I went back in with my markers and changed the shadows a little bit, adding more depth to the part that's close to the white tip of the tail. And now I think this looks much better. Again, adding more and more layers to get that nice and rich depth. And after that, I moved on and started coloring the white areas. For those, I'm going to use some warm gray markers. These are BG4 and BG2. I am adding them to those areas and then blending them out with a colorless blender. For the tail, I'm going to use some flicking motions of my wrist to create some nice texture and make the fur there look really nice and fluffy. And the way I'm adding the flicks is always by keeping in mind the fact that some areas are going to be darker and some areas are going to be lighter. So I have a higher concentration of darker flicks where I think my shadows will fall. And then I left some white highlights towards the areas that I thought were going to be lighter. I colored in the nose and the little paw of the fox, and then I moved on and started working on the bear. I realized there that I had missed one of the arms of the fox, so I quickly filled that in with my TN8, TN7, TN5 and BO3 markers. I skipped the BO1 because that paw is on the background with respect to the rest of the fox's body, so it will be darker. And then for the bear, I decided to use some red-brown markers, so this is the RB family. Again, I'm starting with my lighter marker, sort of mapping out the shadows, and then when I think that I have the feel for how I'm supposed to shade the image, I'm going to go in with my darker markers. For my shadows, I used the RB4 marker, and for my mid-tone, I'm using the RB2. For my highlights, I used the RB1 marker, and I'm going to use that to also blend my mid-tone marker. I added some shadows on the head of the bear because there is a little kitten sitting on top, which will cast a shadow. You will see it in the final image, it will be a little bit more clear to you. And I also wanted to say that I know that right now you don't really see the stamped images, but that's not the case in real person. So I didn't have any trouble in figuring out where the lines were. In the end, you do get this beautiful no-line coloring look, but when you stamp the images, it's clear where the stamped lines are, so that's pretty neat. And I really love this no-line coloring look. It makes me think about these children's illustration books, which have such a romantic feel to them, and I felt that these beautiful illustrations were just perfect to be colored with this style. Coming back to the card, I used my EB7 marker to darken the shadows a little bit more and get that really nice contrast going on in the areas where all the critters are hugging, so on the bear's belly. I blended everything out using the rest of the markers that I used for the bear. So again, those are RB4, RB2 and RB1. And then with the same colors, I moved on and colored the paws of the bear too. At this point, I realized that I had missed the belly of the fox, so I went back in with my BG4 and BG2 markers and quickly filled in that area. And I also filled in the areas of the belly of the bear that would show behind the piglet and the little rabbit. For the rabbit itself, I used some MB markers. These are some muted browns. I debated whether to leave the rabbit white, so whether to color him with some warm grays, but because I have the warm grays on the white areas of the fox, I thought they would blend in too much. So I went for this rather light brown color combination, which I felt was kind of the right one to complement the rest of the colors that I have on my card. The colors that I used are MB4, MB3 and MB1, and then I also came in later on with my EB4 marker. I wasn't feeling that this color combination was giving me enough depth. I felt that the rabbit was still quite flat compared to the rest of the animals in this little hug, so I decided to use another color. Here I was trying to see if by layering my markers I was going to get enough contrast, but eventually I figured out that I did need a fourth color. And that's when my EB4 came in. So you see on pretty much every image I'm mixing in markers from different color families. I had the TN3 on the pig, that is a brown, whereas the rest of the colors were skin tones. On the fox, I mixed some warm browns with some oranges. Here and on the bear, I'm mixing browns from different color families. The important thing, at least for me, is to have a swatch of my markers so I can see what they actually look like on paper, and then I can pick and choose which ones I feel are going to work nicely together. Using those same colors, I colored in the tail, and I'm basically following the lines that are drawn by the artist to make sure that I keep that nice texture there. And next I went ahead and colored the little bird. I started by using some golden browns, so the darker marker is my GB6, and then I blended that out with my GB3. I decided that the browns were a little bit too brown, so I went over the entire area with a GY2 marker, and then I kept going in back and forth with my markers until I got a nice depth and a rich contrast. For the beak, I used BO3 and BO1. I had to be careful to go around that area while coloring the bear so that I wouldn't completely color over the beak, but it wasn't too hard to do because the tips of these markers are actually quite precise. The last image for today is this cute little kitty, and I started by first coloring in the spots with some TN markers. So I used TN3, TN5 and TN7. And then I first decided that I wanted to have the kitty almost like a vanilla color, but then I wasn't getting the results that I wanted in terms of contrast and depth. So I'm going to end up having him a little bit more on the orange side, always not a bright color. And I think I actually like the result better that way. So I started by laying down my GY3 marker in the dark areas, and then I blended that out first with a GY2 and then with a GY1. As I said, I wasn't quite getting the contrast that I wanted, so I decided I would bring up the GY3 a little bit more, make that my mid-tone color, and then use a BO3 marker for my shadows. So I'm going to add that basically at the base of the cat's body, on the left part of his back and his tail, and then I'm going to use my GY3 and GY2 markers to blend everything out. In order to bring back in the details of the eyes and the mouths of the critters, I went in with a fine liner. This is a Copic multi-liner in the size 03. I actually first penciled in those areas because I really didn't want to mess this up after all the coloring, and then I went over those lines with the fine liner. Next, I stamped the sentiment on the top of my card. This is also part of the Bear Hugs stamp set, but if you decide to follow along, I would actually caution you to wait and stamp the sentiment later, because what I decided to do at this stage was to start adding some shading to the whole panel using Distress Oxides. I wasn't sure where I was going. Actually, I basically loved this stamp set so much that I only wanted to sit down and color it, and I wasn't really planning my card ahead very much. So I first started to blend whatever ink I had left on my blending brushes around the edges of the cardstock, and then I realized that I was liking the result quite a bit. So I decided to be a little bit braver and to actually take out my Distress Oxides and use them to add even more shading. I started first with my Distress Oxide in Vintage Photo that I used to darken up the edges of the cardstock, and also I'm going to sort of move inwards with my brush without actually going over the areas where I have my critters. I wanted to add another shade, and I felt that the antique linen was going to warm up the scene even more, so I'm going to add that too. The reason why I suggested that you wait to stamp your sentiment until after you're done blending your Distress Oxides is that because of their pigment component, they are opaque, so they will kind of mute down your sentiment. You can see it's not anymore nice and crisp and black. Luckily for me, I hadn't removed the stamp from my Misty, so I could go ahead and stamp over it again, but it would be safer to just wait until the very end. Here I decided to add a little bit of ground espresso just to the very edges, and I wasn't worrying about the sentiment anymore because I'm not going over that area at all. And then I basically couldn't stop with this card as usual, so I decided to add a little bit of a glow around the images, mostly because I felt that the white areas that were left around the image were kind of clashing a little bit with the warmth of the rest of the scene. So I used my GY1 marker, I went around the entire image, and then I blended the line that I created with my colorless blender so that I would get a softer transition. The last step was to add a few sequins on my card front. These are gold matte sequins by Studio Katia, and I felt they were really perfect because they add just the right amount of light on the card, but because they are matte, they don't take away from the soft muted look of the overall design. And that's it for today. If you guys enjoyed this video, you can let me know by giving it a thumbs up and leaving a comment in the description box down below. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to my channel for more card making and paper crafting inspiration. You will find a list of all the supplies that I used on my blog and in the description box down below. Thank you all so much for stopping by and have a great day.